morning, lovelies. It's actually the afternoon, but who cares? Today we are asking and answering the question, what is the difference between fiction and nonfiction? Literally, we're asking what's the difference between fantasy and reality, so I'm a little concerned that this ranked so high in YouTube search results. But, you know, you guys asked and I am here to deliver, so let's get started. We'll start with fiction. Fiction is a genre that depicts imaginary events and or people. Now, usually when someone says they're reading or writing fiction, and just fiction, they usually mean literary fiction or realistic fiction. Things that could plausibly happen in the real world because they obey things like the laws of physics and they take place in real-ish areas like the United States or Canada or New York. However, fiction itself is also a granddaddy term that encompasses fantasy, science fiction, horror, superhero, all that other fantastical stuff. If it's literary fiction, then it's set in the boring real world with stuff that could conceivably happen, realistic events and people. If it's genre fiction, then it's all the fun stuff. So, what is nonfiction? It's the exact opposite. It is when everything in the book is, hypothetically at least, true. These are your biographies, your science textbooks, your histories, your documentaries. Sometimes later research will show that the information in that book or movie or documentary is incorrect. Sometimes the author is writing with a very obvious slant or bias toward or against certain people. Or the information presented in the book will be taken completely out of context. But for the most part, give or take some human error, stories in nonfiction are true. They actually happened. They are at least trying to convey actual information about a specific topic. Now, what about those stories that are based on true events or inspired by a true story? What about historical fiction that uses actual characters and or real life events? Or horror movies that say they're based on a true story? Or other stories that are labeled fiction but claim to be fact? Well, that depends. It depends largely on whether or not the writer or creator is saying that it's based on or inspired by either a true story or true events. So let's break all of these down. That's right, it's a What's the Difference video within a What's the Difference video. Videoception? Based on a true story. These movies or books will be as close to fact as the medium allows. Liberties are probably taken in terms of dialogue, multiple real-life people may be combined into cinematic amalgams, or other characters will be excluded for the sake of time. But even with those liberties, you can expect the story to be largely true to what actually happened. I'd say about 75% true portrayal here. Chernobyl, Lincoln, and 127 Hours are all based on true stories. So then we have inspired by a true story. There's a lot more creative leeway given here. Basically, the writers took a few names and achievements, kept the very basics of what they did, and then made up everything else. I'd say most inspiration porn lives in this zone. So for example, the two lead characters in The Pursuit of Happiness were real, but everything else in that movie is either fictional or exaggerated. For example, the kid in the movie is 5 years old, whereas the kid in real life was 2. So about like 50% accuracy if you're lucky. Based on true events. Basically, we're talking historical fiction with original characters. These stories will usually take place during recognizable historical events, like the sinking of the Titanic, or Pompeii, or Nazi Germany, but it will focus on a fictional micro-story happening within that real backdrop. Real historical figures will often pop up in the background to give legitimacy to the story. So for example, a Victorian-style romance set in Victorian England is probably going to have Queen Victoria pop up or at least be talked about at some point in the story. But 90% of that story is focused instead on 2 or more totally fake fictional characters living in that real world setting. Queen Victoria's reign did happen even if that specific love story did not. Going back to Titanic, that is the pinnacle example of based on true events. The Titanic was real. It sank. A lot of people died. But there was no Jack or Rose. In this case, the only thing true about the story is the event itself. And sometimes they even get some of that wrong. Now, inspired by true events. Sometimes inspired by a true case for mysteries and thrillers. This is pure fiction, guys. Essentially, the entire story is made up, even if it parallels true events in some key ways. The events in the movie Fargo never happened as depicted in that story. But when you research the crime that inspired the script, you do see a couple of key details that mirror each other. It still doesn't make the movie true. 0 to 5% accuracy here. Now, for a bonus 5th category, horror movies that are based on something. The wording's usually different with each title, based on actual case studies or based on true files or whatever. You'll note that they do not use the words events or story here, because they're not really using the actual story of what happened. They take a few creepy events, a couple of superstitions, and then they run with it. We have 0 to 1% accuracy here. That's the difference between fiction, nonfiction, and everything in between. If you liked this video, I've got a whole playlist dedicated to asking what's the difference, so you can check that out. I will see you next time. Bye, lovelies!